So let's just get into it and welcome Professor Robert Patman to the show. Good evening, sir. It's been a while.
Yes, indeed. Good evening, Pat. Good evening, Chewy.
It's been a minute, as the kids say, Robert. It's been a minute since we've had a catch-up.
A minute.
Thanks so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure.
Whilst I was prepping for the show, before you and I talked, I actually found a clip that's about 2.5 minutes long that talks, and this is from the Wall Street Journal, and it's not really opinion, that talks a little bit about the timeline. Do you think, because I know you've got limited time, we should play this 2.5 minutes to give people an up-to-date and then we can talk about it? Or should we just talk about it? What do you think, Robert?
I think you should play it.
Okay. All right. So this is a timeline that came out about 15 hours ago from the Wall Street Journal, and it is just basically a timeline of events leading to, well, I guess 15 hours ago. Let's have a look.
On April 1st, an Iranian diplomatic building in Damascus was hit in what Iran says was an Israeli airstrike. The strike killed top Iranian military officials, including a senior member of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps elite Quds Force. It was one of the highest profile killings of Iranian military leaders in years. Israel didn't confirm or deny responsibility for the strike, but Iran publicly threatened to retaliate following the attack.
Israel and Iran have had a years-long shadow war. They don't attack each other directly. Iran attacks Israel through proxies, and Israel responds directly against those proxies, as opposed to directly against Iran on Iranian soil. What was different here is that this was the most direct attack on an Iranian asset that we have seen.
On April 4th, Israelis started to report GPS errors, with some apps placing Tel Aviv residents in
This is madness, the technology.
Some 130 miles to the north. The reason? The Israeli military was scrambling GPS signals within the country to thwart missile and drone targeting systems.
אנחנו נדע להגן על עצמנו, ואנחנו נפעל לפי העיקרון הפשוט שמי שפוגע בנו או מתכנן לפגוע בנו, אנחנו נפגע בו.
On April 10th, Iran's supreme leader said that the strikes in Syria constituted an attack on Iranian soil.
I'll just pause this for a sec because we do have an audio podcast. Benjamin Netanyahu basically just said, if you hurt us, we'll hurt you. And now the Supreme Leader, is that the correct title? Says the wicked regime of Israel made a mistake in this case. It must be punished, and it will be punished. For those in the audio podcast.
The same day, President Joe Biden reaffirmed U.S. support for Israel.
As I told Prime Minister Netanyahu, our commitment to Israel's security against these threats from Iran and its proxies is ironclad. Let me say it again, ironclad. We're going to do all we can to protect Israel's security.
On the 10th, it also emerged that U.S. intelligence reports showed that an attack could be imminent, according to U.S. officials. The tension came to a head on April 13th, when Iran began sending drones and missiles toward Israel. Air raid sirens blared across Israel and explosions were heard over Jerusalem as Israel's Iron Dome air defense system kicked in. Biden met with his national security team and issued a statement condemning the attacks and said the US helped Israel take down nearly all of the incoming drones and missiles. By early morning of April 14th, Israel lifted sheltering orders, a sign that it believes the brunt of the attack is over.
So there's a timeline, Robert. Are you pretty happy that that's up to date for now? Is there anything we want to add to the timeline as reported by the Wall Street Journal?
I think it's reasonably up to date, yeah.
Okay, so where are we at?
Where are we at? Well, we're at at the moment, the United States under the Biden administration has said that they will not support retaliation by the Netanyahu government against Iran.
Yep. And
are working behind the scenes to try to prevent Netanyahu from retaliating. I think Mr. Netanyahu is probably under pressure from his hardline extreme right coalition to go after Iran, to retaliate against the retaliation. And let's be quite clear, as that commentary suggested in the Wall Street clip, Iran and Israel have been shadowboxing for some time.
Yeah.
And it should be pointed out, Mr. Netanyahu was a vehement opponent of Mr. Obama's nuclear deal, which postponed the development of Iran's nuclear weapons in return for lifting sanctions against Iran. Mr. Netanyahu really posed that deal. He was very pleased when Trump scuttled it, and it now means that Iran is very close to developing nuclear weapons. And the other thing we've got to keep in mind here, and it's really important that we don't overlook it, but the attack, the commentary started off with the attack on the diplomatic premises of Iran in Damascus, Syria. All diplomatic premises are covered by the Vienna Convention in 1961, which means that diplomatic premises are off limits for reasons of diplomatic immunity. And this was a clear breach of that convention. Now, Israel's responded by saying...
So, Robert, can I ask this? So that means it's a war crime?
Yes. It's a serious infringement of international law. I'm not saying it's a war crime, but 7 people died and 3 senior leaders of the Iranian government. Now, the Israelis said they didn't recognize that this was a proper diplomatic establishment because it contained senior leaders of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard within it. But, all diplomatic establishments contain military and intelligence personnel within them, virtually all of them. So where do you draw the line? Because do you make an exception for Israel? That has huge implications. My big worry here is we're seeing a serious erosion, and we have been for the last 6 months. We're seeing a bonfire of international law. And I think this is bad, particularly for small and middle-sized countries, because countries like our country depends on rules and norms rather than power in order to conduct itself internationally. So I think it's important to establish the context in which Iran retaliated. And as the commentary, as that clip showed, Iran felt this was a direct attack on its sovereignty and quoted Article 51 of the UN before it launched that attack, or just after, actually, to be precise. This is 2 wrongs don't make a right. I didn't like the retaliation by, this massive attack, but I didn't like the actions of the Israelis. And what particularly shocked me is that no Western countries, including the United States or our own, rebuked Israel for breaching this diplomatic convention.
Yeah,
that you don't attack the messengers. And so I'm concerned about this. I think New Zealand's government should be concerned about this because, as I say, we have a big stake in international law in a way that's different from the United States and the United Kingdom, who have that get out of jail card called a veto in the UN. We don't have that, and therefore we depend so much more on rules being observed. And it's very important, I think, to keep that in mind.
I've got maybe it's a bit of a pithy question, I'm not sure, but we get told a lot by supporters of Israel that Israel has the right to defend itself because Hamas entered Israel and did those atrocious, horrific war crimes within the music festival and other places. Could one, if one wanted to, follow the same argument and say Iran has the right to defend itself because of the breaking of the Geneva Convention by Israel? I mean, and I'm not saying either of those positions I take, but lots of people do take the position of Israel has the right to defend itself because Hamas attacked Israel. Therefore, Iran has the right to defend itself because Israel attacked Iran. Is that a fair comparison to make in this situation?
Well, first of all, the right of self-defense is not limitless.
Yeah.
And if you take Gaza, it doesn't include killing innocent people who had nothing to do with the Hamas attack.
We're with you.
And also
100%.
And also with respect to Iran, their right of self-defense, which they quoted to justify sending more than 300 missiles and drones towards Israel. Many of them were intercepted, we understand, actually all of them virtually. but still, that was a pretty. It was a choreographed or telegraphed move. They let the Americans know and they let the Israelis know that this was going to happen, and they concluded at the end of this high-risk operation. They made a statement and said, "That's it. We've concluded it was a successful mission or successful operation." And as far as we're concerned, that concludes things. Whether Mr. Netanyahu accepts that. And another thing that we've got to keep in mind here is that Mr. Netanyahu has a political interest in, as his critics point out, in Israel, in continuing to engage in conflict. If there is a lasting ceasefire, he may well become, it could be the signal for him to leave office, because there's a lot of domestic opposition to Netanyahu. There's fury that he hasn't got the hostages out. His argument has always been, trust me, we'll use military power, and that'll be the best way of releasing the hostages, because there's a lot of families in Israel now who believe they may never see the hostages, and the pulverizing of the air and ground offensive in Gaza has obviously increased the chances that they may be killed. Now, it's an appalling thing to take hostages, and I'm not justifying it anyway. I wish Hamas would release the hostages immediately, and that to me would be a good step forward. It would undercut Netanyahu, by the way. But the point is that I think there is a serious concern within Israel that Mr. Netanyahu may have launched that attack on the Iranians, partly to widen the war. There's no doubt about it. Iran has been prodding at Israel through Hezbollah and the Houthis. So I'm not trying to say it's all one way. But there is a big concern here, which the Americans must be aware of, that to me, there's two red lines coming up. The first red line, the Americans have said publicly they do not support retaliation by Netanyahu's government against Iran. Will that stop him? And what will happen if he crosses that red line? Second red line is the Americans have categorically said he must not launch a full-blown offensive in Rafah, where there's high concentration of Palestinian civilians. And he said repeatedly he will. So, you know, America has enormous leverage in this situation, but it's very reluctant to use it. And you know, it's going to be very interesting because Mr. Biden's domestic situation in electoral terms is showing signs of fraying. So there's a lot of young people who would vote Democrat who probably won't be in the next election. And of course, that raises the specter of Mr. Trump making a comeback.
Good Lord. Imagine that. Chewy, you got something, mate? Jump in.
Oh, there's so much to unpack there. I mean, as far as taking on a diplomatic post, like bombing a diplomatic post in a third country, I don't think that there is a country on earth that would just let that slide. This is like Russia bombing the US embassy in Poland. And I don't think the Americans would let that lie. I don't think that realistically Iran launched this attack with any real hope of anything getting through Iron Dome. It seems to me that they've launched cheap drones and old ballistic missiles as kind of a message. They telegraphed the attack. They warned everybody in the region that it was happening. And as you mentioned, the absolute cherry on the top is that statement they put out that basically went, and we conclude this matter. You know, Iran, as much as I am not a fan of that regime for so many reasons, seemed to play the diplomatic game here very, very well.
And I think you're right, Chewy. I think it was 13 days, the interval between the attack on the Iranian consulate in Damascus and when they launched this retaliation. So it was a carefully measured response. I think it was done with following discussions, indirect discussions with the Americans. The Americans certainly knew it was coming and they were warning the Israelis. The situation now, though, is very dangerous because it has been dangerous throughout. This, by the way, we're talking about a situation which was eminently predictable once America gave unconditional support to Israelis' retaliation against Hamas. It should never have been unconditional. I was shocked by that. They know Netanyahu full well, and they know that he's in denial about a Palestinian state. So we have a situation now where the Americans are arming another country, and they're using American weapons for purposes that America doesn't support. America wants a two-state solution. Netanyahu doesn't. Can you think of? It's very difficult to name another country which gives a great expense to itself weapons for a purpose which it doesn't endorse. So yeah, I mean that's it's an extraordinary situation, but it's going to have a domestic price in the United States, I fear, for the Biden administration, and it's also a bit of a test. I think I was quite impressed by Mr. Peter's speech in the UN General Assembly. I thought it was belated. It was a great speech, but it was 4 months too late. It should have been given at the end of October. I think he said all the right things. I just wish it had been said a lot earlier because, unfortunately, New Zealand, which is widely respected as a country, a sort of voice of reason in many respects, we don't have an axe to grind in the Middle East. And I think, had we been a little bit more vocal, we might have acted as a playmaker, as a country that could ask the Americans to rethink their strategy. I mean, the other liberal democracies, it's easy to blame and quite rightly so, because the Biden administration have basically facilitated this awful situation in Gaza, which can only be described as, a stain on humanity. In the 21st century, we have more than 33,000 Palestinians killed following a dreadful attack, as Pat pointed out, on Israel. But two wrongs do not, make the right outcome. And, 14,000 children have been killed who, by definition, were not involved in Hamas. And the world has largely stood there and watched because of the absurd system of vetoes within the UN Security Council. We have 5 countries who can basically block anything they don't like. But the irony is they can't solve the problems themselves. So we're falling between two stools. We're denied an international solution. The majority of the UN, by the end of October, saw the necessity for an immediate and lasting ceasefire. Since then, since the end of October last year, that possibility has been repeatedly thwarted by the use of the veto. Even when the Security Council belatedly, about 2 or 3 weeks ago, finally passed a resolution calling for an immediate ceasefire, because the United States didn't exercise its veto, it abstained. But guess what? The Americans then declared that resolution was not binding, which is extraordinary because every single resolution of the Security Council is binding. That's the distinction between the General Assembly and the Security Council in the UN. Resolutions passed by the General Assembly are not binding. Those passed by the Security Council are. So it's at the moment, we're seeing a situation which is tragic and dysfunctional. And as one American commentator put it recently, it's difficult to argue that Israel is now more secure after 6 months than it was, when Hamas had attacked. So it's very different. And now we have the specter of the war spreading. Something's got to give in this situation. At some point, Mr. Biden is going to come under serious pressure from his own party to rein in Netanyahu, I believe. It was very striking a week ago, a letter signed by even Nancy Pelosi, a great supporter of Israel, basically said that we need an immediate ceasefire.
Yeah.
And it is a very difficult situation.
Hey, Robert, thanks for joining us tonight. We stayed for a few extra minutes than we would have you for, so we'll leave it there and let you go. Thank you so much for joining in with the conversation. We'd love to have you again super soon, or maybe we'll see you down the Octagon sometime.
Okay. Thanks very much.
Thanks,
Cheers.
Robert.